If you drive out into the high desert of southern New Mexico, the world starts to feel very far away. The land flattens out into sand and brush, broken only by low hills and the glint of Elephant Butte Lake in the distance. It's the kind of place people visit to fish, to camp, to get away from everything. A few dusty roads branch off the highway toward scattered mobile homes and RVs, their porch lights flickering weakly against a huge, dark sky. On one of those roads, on a March evening in 1999, a woman was running for her life. She was naked, bleeding, and barefoot. A heavy metal collar hung around her neck, trailing chains that clanged against each other every time her feet hit the dirt. She had a black eye and dried blood in her hair. Every breath felt like it might be her last, but she ran anyway, because she was sure of two things. If she stopped, she would die. And if she didn't get someone to listen to her story, other women would die too. She stumbled up to a nearby mobile home and started pounding on the door with everything she had left. Inside, a couple watched TV, the soft glow of the screen lighting up their living room. They heard the frantic banging, the metal scraping against metal, and for a second they hesitated. Out in a place like Elephant Butte, you don't usually open your door after dark to trouble. But something in that sound told them this wasn't just trouble. They opened the door and came face to face with a nightmare that looked like it had clawed its way out of a horror movie and into their front yard. The woman was sobbing, hysterical, half choking on her own words as she begged them to help her, begged them to call the police. They pulled her inside, wrapped a blanket around her, and dialed 911. Her name was Cynthia Vigil, and what she told officers who arrived at that trailer home would open the door, literally and figuratively, on one of the most sadistic predators in American history, a man later known as the Toy Box Killer. Before we go any further, I want to be very clear about what we're talking about tonight. This case involves kidnapping, sexual violence, and torture. I'm not going to get graphic or voyeuristic. That's not what we do here. But even at a high level, some of these details are deeply disturbing. If that's not something you're up for right now, please feel free to skip this episode or come back another time. Your mental health matters more than any true crime story. For everyone still with me, let's go back to that night, because the moment Cynthia escaped is the moment the mask finally slipped. When officers pulled up to the couple's mobile home, what they saw instantly told them this wasn't a simple domestic dispute. Cynthia was still in chains, still wearing that iron collar. She was shaking so hard the metal links rattled. She told them she'd been kidnapped from Albuquerque days earlier by a man and a woman, driven out here to the town of Elephant Butte, and held prisoner in a trailer that wasn't like any trailer they'd ever seen. It was soundproof, she said. It was full of equipment and tools she didn't even have names for. There were chains and shackles and a table that looked like it belonged in a medical exam room. There were mirrors and cameras and things hanging from the ceiling. The man called it his toy box. Cynthia told police she'd been held there for about 3 days. She said the man and his girlfriend had chained her down, drugged her, assaulted her, and told her they'd done this to other women before. At some point, he'd played her a recording, a long, cold monologue explaining what was going to happen to her, making it crystal clear she was not his first victim and wouldn't be his last. Sitting in that living room, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, Cynthia made a decision. She was not going to let this end with just her. When she saw a small opening, when the man left for work and the woman got distracted, she grabbed a set of keys that had been left on a table, unlocked part of her chains, fought back, and fled into the desert with the collar still around her neck. Now she was here, begging police to believe her and to move fast. The man she was talking about was a 59-year-old local mechanic and state park employee named David Parker Ray. If you had passed Ray on the street in Truth or Consequences, the nearest town, you probably wouldn't have thought twice about him. He was the definition of unremarkable. Thinning hair, a mustache, deep lines in his face from too many years in the sun. He'd worked various mechanical jobs, including as a maintenance worker at Elephant Butte Lake State Park. He liked boats, cars, dogs. He had a girlfriend, Cindy Hendy. He had kids from earlier relationships. To neighbors, he was gruff but not especially memorable. But behind that ordinary exterior was someone investigators would later describe as one of the most sadistically organized offenders they'd ever encountered. To understand how his toy box came to exist in the first place, you have to go back decades. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, a small railroad town south of Albuquerque. His parents struggled financially and eventually sent David and his younger sister to live with their strict grandparents on a ranch. His father was violent and alcoholic, drifting in and out of David's life, sometimes bringing him magazines filled with sadomasochistic imagery that no child should ever have been exposed to. At school, David was shy, especially around girls, and he was relentlessly bullied for it. As he got older, he started drinking and experimenting with drugs, numbing himself while privately nursing violent sexual fantasies that would eventually become the core of who he was. Classmates later remembered him as awkward and withdrawn, the kind of kid you might forget as soon as you looked away. After high school, he served in the U.S. Army and trained as a mechanic. It was the perfect skill set for someone who would later spend years quietly building and modifying equipment in a way that didn't draw much suspicion. When he came back to New Mexico, he settled into blue-collar work, patching together a life that looked relatively normal from the outside. But under the surface, something else was taking shape, and it was taking shape inside a trailer parked near a small, unimpressive mobile home in Elephant Butte. In the 1990s, Ray acquired a large white semi-trailer and began converting it into what he privately called his toy box. He insulated the walls, added soundproofing, and installed a heavy, reinforced door with multiple locks. Inside, he mounted a medical-style gynecological chair in the center of the trailer and surrounded it with shelves of tools, restraints, and devices he'd either purchased or built himself. He hung chains from the ceiling. He added pulleys and hooks. He rigged up lights and mirrors in ways designed to keep his victims from ever feeling like they could look away. He even took the time to decorate parts of the interior with drawings and diagrams, visual reminders of what he planned to do. He kept notebooks and logs, carefully documenting dates and details in a way that would later make investigators believe they were only seeing a fraction of his crimes. It is important to say this again. We are not going to walk through the specifics of what he did in that trailer. The broad strokes are awful enough. This was a man who methodically planned out the kidnapping, restraint, and prolonged sexual torture of women he considered disposable. He treated human beings as test subjects in his own private laboratory of control. For years, he got away with it. What made him so dangerous wasn't just the cruelty of his fantasies, it was the patience and organization he brought to fulfilling them. He carefully picked victims he believed were less likely to be reported missing or taken seriously. Sex workers, women struggling with addiction, women on the margins. He sometimes used his girlfriend or even his own daughter to help lure victims, making the situation look less threatening at first glance. He used drugs, including powerful sedatives, to keep his captives disoriented and to blur their memories of what had happened to them, banking on the idea that even if they were released or escaped, they wouldn't be believed. By the time Cynthia Vigil was taken, Ray had likely been doing this for years, maybe decades. Cynthia was 22 and living in Albuquerque, about 150 miles from Elephant Butte. She'd had a hard life, including violence and loss, and she was working in street-level sex work when she crossed paths with Ray and Hendy in March 1999. They posed as customers. Once she was in their vehicle, the situation turned. They pulled out what looked like law enforcement credentials and handcuffs. They told her she was under arrest. In that moment, Cynthia thought she was dealing with some kind of corrupt cop, not a sadist with a customized torture trailer in the desert. That detail is important because it shows one of the psychological levers Ray liked to pull: authority. If he could convince a victim he was in charge, that there was no point in fighting, he had already won half the battle in his mind. They took her to Elephant Butte, chained her in the trailer, and began the pattern of abuse he'd refined over years. At one point, he played that recording, a pre-written, pre-recorded orientation tape he used on multiple victims. In a flat, clinical tone, he told her what would be done to her, how long it might last, and what would happen if she resisted. He made sure she understood that, as far as he was concerned, she was not a person anymore. She was property. It was a monstrous script, but it also tells us something about him. Most offenders in this category operate in the moment, chasing impulses. Ray didn't do that. He rehearsed. He wrote, recorded, revised. He wanted total control, not just over bodies but over minds. He wanted to break people from the inside out. 3 days into Cynthia's captivity, that control finally slipped. On the morning of March 22nd, Ray left the property for his job, assuming his victim was securely chained. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, was inside the trailer with Cynthia when the phone rang. Hendy walked away to answer it. In that small gap, Cynthia's brain did something that's incredibly common in survivors of long-term abuse. It focused like a laser on the first real opportunity. She spotted the keys Hendy had left too close, stretched against the chain until the metal cut into her skin, and got her hands on them. Heart pounding, She fought with the locks around her body. Hendy realized what was happening and rushed back, and the two women struggled. Hendy grabbed something heavy, later described as a lamp, and hit Cynthia in the head, but Cynthia kept going, unlocking enough restraints to get loose. She grabbed an ice pick and struck back, then bolted out of the trailer and into the bright, blinding New Mexico sun, naked except for that collar and chain. Think about that moment for a second. She's alone, badly injured, disoriented, and in the middle of nowhere on a property controlled by a man who has already told her he's hurt other women and gotten away with it. There are no guarantees that anyone will open their door. There's every reason to believe that if she's caught, her suffering will get even worse. And she runs anyway. When we talk about survivors of extreme violence, it's easy to focus so much on the horror that we overlook the courage. Cynthia's escape did not happen because David Parker Ray made a mistake. It happened because Cynthia refused to give up when most people's bodies and minds would have simply shut down. Her escape also cracked open something else, the illusion of safety that had allowed Ray to keep operating in plain sight. Once officers heard her initial story and saw the chains still around her neck, they moved quickly. They secured the scene at the mobile home and then headed for Ray's property at 513 Bass Road, where Cynthia said she'd been held. This is where the procedural context matters for an American audience. Even in a high-emotion situation, they needed probable cause and, ideally, warrants to fully search private property. But a victim in chains describing an ongoing kidnapping is about as strong as probable cause gets. When police reached Ray's place, they found the mobile home he shared with Hendy and, parked nearby, that large white semi-trailer. The trailer door was locked, reinforced, and clearly not just some casual storage unit. Officers could see that the entire setup was designed around it. Once they got the door open and stepped inside, the tone of the entire investigation changed. Even veteran detectives were stunned by what they saw. This wasn't a messy crime scene or a chaotic dungeon pulled together with scraps. It was organized, deliberate, chillingly professional in its own twisted way. The central chair, the chains, the shelves of tools and restraints, the diagrams, the cameras, the speakers wired to play that recorded message, all of it pointed to planning that had taken years, not weeks. There was no question anymore that Cynthia was telling the truth. Officers immediately detained Ray and Hendy. As word spread through the small law enforcement community around truth or consequences in Elephant Butte, more resources poured in. The FBI got involved. Crime scene techs spent days photographing and cataloging every inch of that trailer. They seized notebooks and diaries that appeared to document multiple assaults over the years, sometimes with dates and vague descriptions of victims. They collected jewelry, clothing, and personal items that clearly didn't all belong to the people living in that home. When investigators opened those notebooks and saw entries suggesting that dozens of women had been in that trailer before, a new, horrifying question took shape. If this is how many we can see on paper, how many are missing? As Cynthia recovered, detectives started looking for anyone whose story might match hers. That's when other women began to come forward. One of them was Angelica Montano, who told police she'd been picked up by Ray and Hendy, held in the trailer, assaulted, and then released on the side of the road. When she first reported it months earlier, her story hadn't gone anywhere. She'd been written off as unreliable. Now, hearing about Cynthia's escape on the news, she realized she hadn't been alone. Another was a woman named Kelly Garrett, sometimes identified in reports under her married name, Van Cleve. In 1996, she'd gone out to play pool in Truth or Consequences after having a fight with her husband. A friend, later revealed to have connections to Ray, invited her to hang out. At some point in the evening, Kelly believed her drink had been drugged. Her next clear memory was waking up in pain, chained in a strange room that felt like a medical facility and a nightmare all at once. Later, she woke up again in a different place, near her in-laws' home. Her ex-husband was told she'd run off with another man. Kelly's memories of the incident were hazy and fragmented, like a bad dream, and for years she tried to convince herself that's all it had been. When she saw David Parker Ray's face and that white trailer on the news after Cynthia's escape, years of buried trauma crashed back to the surface. She realized what had actually happened to her, and that she'd survived a man who probably hadn't let all his victims go. Stories like Angelica's and Kelly's are part of why investigators now believe Ray had far more victims than the 3 women whose cases were ultimately tied to his convictions. He kept writings that suggested he'd been abducting and assaulting women since at least the 1980s, possibly earlier. Some entries hinted at murders, though he was never convicted of killing anyone. The FBI would eventually estimate that he may have had around 40 victims, and some reports, based on statements from accomplices, suggest the number could be higher. That raises another question people still debate today. How does someone like this operate for so long without being caught? Part of the answer lies in who he targeted. If you pick victims who are already dismissed by society, people with unstable housing, people with addiction issues, sex workers, you're counting on a cruel reality. When they vanish, fewer people with power push for answers. When they try to report, they're not always believed. Ray knew that. He weaponized it. He also used location to his advantage. Elephant Butte and the surrounding desert offered endless places to hide evidence. Investigators searched the lake, combed the property with cadaver dogs and metal detectors, and dug in suspected burial sites, but no bodies conclusively linked to him have ever been found. The same landscape that draws campers and boaters with its beauty also gave a predator cover. And then there's the psychological factor. Most of us carry what's called a normalcy bias. We assume that the world around us is basically safe, that the people we interact with are basically like us. We don't want to believe that the quiet mechanic down the street, the guy who helps launch boats at the lake, might be running a soundproof torture chamber in his spare time. That kind of thing belongs in movies, not real life. Ray took advantage of that too. He divided his life into compartments: the hard-working state park employee, the neighbor, the boyfriend, and then, behind a locked door, the sadistic offender whose entire identity was built around domination and pain. As the investigation ramped up, prosecutors faced a difficult task. They had an incredibly disturbing crime scene, survivors willing to testify, and journals suggesting many more victims. But they didn't have any confirmed bodies. They also had to deal with the fact that some of Ray's victims had been drugged with substances known to cause confusion and memory gaps. That meant defense attorneys could and did attack their credibility. To give those survivors the best chance of being believed in court, prosecutors decided to try Ray separately for each known victim. It was a way of focusing the jury's attention on one story at a time, instead of overwhelming them with a tangle of allegations. The legal process dragged on for years, full of motions, mistrials, and appeals. Each step forced survivors like Cynthia and Kelly to relive their trauma in excruciating detail. Eventually, facing the possibility of additional trials and a potential death penalty, Ray took a plea deal. He admitted guilt on multiple counts of kidnapping and sexual torture, and was sentenced to more than 200 years in prison. His daughter, who'd been implicated in at least one abduction, received a relatively short sentence and probation as part of the deal. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, who had helped lure and abuse victims, but who also provided key testimony against him, received a lengthy sentence but ultimately became eligible for parole after serving a portion of it. Ray himself would not spend long behind bars. In 2002, just a few years after his arrest and not long after his final sentencing hearing, he suffered a heart attack and died in prison. He never led investigators to any bodies. He never provided a full accounting of how many women he'd hurt or killed. Whatever secrets he had about where his victims might be buried went with him to the grave. For the FBI and New Mexico authorities, that wasn't the end of the story. In the years after his death, they released photographs of items recovered from his property: jewelry, clothing, personal belongings, in the hope that families of missing women might recognize something. They dug into cold cases across the Southwest, looking for patterns that matched his movements and methods. They combed through his writings, trying to match dates and descriptions to real women who had vanished. To this day, they believe there are victims whose names we do not know, families who have never connected their loved one's disappearance to a mechanic with a trailer in Elephant Butte. So who is David Parker Ray psychologically? From what we know through case records, interviews, and expert analysis after the fact, he fits many of the hallmarks of an organized, sadistic sexual predator. He had a long developmental arc: early exposure to violent sexual material, social isolation, substance abuse. His fantasies escalated over time, moving from drawings and pornography to carefully planned real-world offenses. He showed an almost obsessive need for control. He wanted to control the setting, which is why he built the trailer. He wanted to control his victims' bodies, which is why he invested so much in restraints and devices. He wanted to control their minds, which is why he wrote and recorded that script, drugged them to distort their memories, and chose victims he believed would not be taken seriously if they ever got away. He also displayed extreme emotional detachment. In his own writings, he showed no empathy for the people he hurt. They were objects, props in his fantasy world. When confronted with allegations, he minimized, deflected, or claimed that what happened in the trailer had been consensual. That type of response is common in individuals with high levels of psychopathic traits. There's no genuine remorse, only annoyance at being caught. At the same time, he was not some criminal mastermind. He drank. He bragged to the wrong people. He kept written records of his crimes. He got comfortable. And in the end, he made the same mistake many long-term offenders do. He underestimated his victims. He underestimated Cynthia. It's easy, in a case like this, to let the monster dominate the story. The headlines call him the toy box killer. Documentaries frame everything around that trailer, that tape, that nickname. But if we're going to tell this story responsibly, especially for an American audience that might be hearing it for the first time, we have to keep coming back to the people who survived him, and to the people who might still be out there unnamed. Cynthia Vigil went on to rebuild her life in the years after her escape. She has spoken publicly about what happened to her, not to sensationalize it, but to push for better treatment of survivors and better support for people who, like her, come from communities that are often written off. She has worked as an advocate, reminding people that she is not just the toy box victim. She is a person with a full life, a family, a voice. Kelly Garrett has talked about the shock of realizing that what she'd tried to dismiss as a horrible dream had actually been a crime scene. She's described the guilt and confusion that came with years of not telling her story, and the complicated relief that came when she finally saw her experience reflected in the news coverage of Ray's arrest. Angelica's story is a reminder of how easily survivors can be ignored the first time they ask for help, and how vital it is for law enforcement to take those first reports seriously, even when details are fuzzy or the victim doesn't seem like the perfect witness. There are also the women we don't know. Every piece of jewelry laid out on an FBI evidence table, every diary entry without a matching name, every date scrawled in the margins of a notebook might represent a person whose family still wonders why they never came home. For those families, David Parker Ray's death in prison is not justice. It's a door slamming shut on the chance to ever hear, from his own mouth, where their daughters, sisters, or mothers ended up. So where does that leave us, sitting here tonight, looking back at a trailer that no longer exists on a patch of desert off a quiet New Mexico road? It leaves us with some hard truths. First, monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like mechanics and park employees, like people you nod to at the gas station. Evil doesn't come with warning labels, which is why paying attention to behavior, not just appearances, matters so much. Second, the people most likely to be targeted are often the ones society has already devalued. If we want fewer predators like David Parker Ray, we have to stop treating some lives as less worth protecting. That means listening to sex workers when they report violence. It means taking missing person reports seriously even when the person has a history of addiction or instability. It means recognizing that vulnerability is something predators actively seek out and exploit. Third, one person paying attention can change everything. The couple who opened their door to Cynthia could have ignored that frantic knocking. They could have told themselves it was a bad dream, a prank, someone else's problem. Instead, they chose to risk that moment of fear and do the right thing. Their decision brought down a predator who had been active for years. And finally, it leaves us with a reminder that survival is not the end of the story for people who make it out of situations like this. Healing is a long, messy process. The legal system can be re-traumatizing. Media attention can feel like another violation when it focuses on lurid details instead of human beings. One of the simplest, most powerful things we can do as consumers of true crime is to talk about these cases in ways that center the victims and survivors, not the man in the mugshot. If you're listening to this and some part of this story hits close to home, if you're a survivor of sexual violence or you care about someone who is, please know there are resources out there. In the U.S., the National Sexual Assault Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-656-HOPE, and at rain.org you can chat with someone online. Reaching out doesn't mean you have to file a report or tell your story before you're ready. It just means you don't have to sit with it alone. As for that patch of desert in Elephant Butte, the trailer is gone. The locks and chains and diagrams have been hauled away as evidence. The lot looks from the road like any other piece of high desert: scrubby plants, pale dirt, a big sky overhead. But for the people who know what happened there, it's a scar on the landscape. Some nights, when the wind runs over that sand and the lake reflects the moon, it probably looks like the peaceful getaway it was always supposed to be. a place for boats and campfires and families on vacation. And maybe that's a kind of healing too, the desert slowly reclaiming a space that was twisted into something it was never meant to be. Still, somewhere out there are families who look at an old photograph and wonder if their missing loved one might be connected to a mechanic with a secret trailer near the water. Somewhere out there is someone who saw or heard something back then and never realized how important it might have been. If that's you, if you lived near Elephant Butte or Truth or Consequences in the 1990s, and you remember a strange encounter, a person who vanished from your orbit, or something odd about a white trailer on a dusty road, law enforcement in New Mexico, and the FBI still accept tips in this case. After all these years, a single memory could be the thread that finally connects one more missing woman to the man who thought he'd erased her. David Parker Ray is dead. His toy box is gone. But the questions he left behind are still very much alive. How many victims were there really? Where are they? And how many other predators like him are hiding right now behind ordinary faces, counting on us to look away? Those are the questions that keep investigators up at night. And they're the questions we have to keep asking every time we talk about a case like this, not to glorify the horror, but to make sure the people who survived it, and the ones who didn't, are never forgotten.